Welcome back to The Artistic Vision, a podcast on theology and the arts. This week's guest is Dr. Matthew Milliner of Wheaton College, professor of art history. He's written on G.K. Chesterton and Indigenous Art and the Everlasting People. He's written on icons of the Mother of God, Mary. He's written on modern art. He is a wealth of information, and I love this conversation. We touch on pretty much all those themes, so there'll be something for you to like and not like probably, but he's such a balanced, fair thinker, convicting, challenging, encouraging. It'll be everything.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, he's got so much energy, and the way he just draws knowledge, just brilliant. Really encouraging too, I think, helping us understand how to look at modern art, but also ancient art, especially in terms of iconography. And so I think that people are really going to enjoy this. Yeah. I say that every week.
Yeah. And we'll put some of his books, and I'd say it in the podcast, but I'll say it now too. You need to subscribe to his monthly blog post that he does on Comment magazine. It is
so good.
The best thing on the internet.
So
it's good. Subscribe to that and enjoy this conversation. All right. Welcome to The Artistic Vision, Dr. Matthew Milliner. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
So we start all of our episodes same way with a very simple question. What is your background in beauty? We know that for some people, raised with an appreciation, whether it's a religious tradition or something like that, what is your interest in beauty? I'm especially interested too in how you came to your interest in art history in particular.
So I grew up obviously enchanted by the natural world, as all of us are. And what I always share with my students, may I never tire of saying it, but that embedded in the Greek word kalos is kalein. I get that from the great theologian Dionysius the Areopagite. And so he says that when we experience beauty, it's not a cosmic burp. It's not an accident. This is something constituent of reality that's summoning you. And so I have, like all of us, have had those childhood experiences. And then the way that my education unfolded, art was the way to keep that alive. There was a covenant between my childhood wonder and what was coming at me through my own early experimentation with artistic media and then my experience of beauty in museums or in a classroom. So it kept that thread intact. And so when I went to college, I was expecting to be a studio major, but when I realized there was such a thing as art history, I said, well, you can just see the images over and over again and connect them to the ideas. And then I was hooked, and I dropped the studio and I stuck with art history because I had such a magnificent art history professor who unfolded that beauty. And he also hadn't broken that covenant with those youthful longings for beauty, because he found that God was the fulfillment of those. And even though he went to Cambridge to get his Ph.D. at a time where religious ideas were completely unacceptable in that environment, it was his faith that led him to art history. So I sort of stepped into the lineage of someone who could bring their Christian faith and the history of arts together, which is not a very commonly done thing, even though it's becoming more fashionable of late, just because it's been so forbidden for a long time. Now there's almost this succès de scandale. It's like, ooh, you think about it that way. The art history discipline is entertaining these ideas again. But when I first learned it, and my advisor who learned it, and certainly my environment in grad school, these ideas just could not come together. And thankfully, that's becoming more and more common now, as the people that have already been on this podcast would attest.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, what about this moment makes these ideas relevant?
Yeah, because I think that the complete materialist view has had its chance. They had a really good run. They tried to do their best. They basically said, oh, what do you know? The Marxist revolution isn't happening the way we had hoped it would by commandeering the heights of high culture. It's not working. And they expressly say that. Like, wow, this is the revolution not unfolding as we had hoped. And because they have gripped the discipline for so long, and not that the high heights of academia really say what's going on the ground. Like on the ground, people who really give themselves to art what they've been really doing is seeking beauty at the end of the day. That's the only reason they keep undergoing the sacrifices to make things, because it costs you to make things. But in the high realms of culture, there was this sense that this revolutionary ideal that is going to be affected through criticism and art history and museums, that really has been the ethos for a time, and it's just not working. And that's okay that it's not working. They had some really good points. And so I think we're just simply experiencing a regime change of sorts. And it's not that, there are many different competing narratives right now, but for a long time, a hard leftist perspective ruled with an iron fist, and it's just not the case anymore. It sort of feels like 1989.
Yeah.
Wow, we can talk about things again. There was sort of a Marxist holdover for a while, at least in the discipline as I understand it.
Yeah, I love Dionysius. One of my supervisors in seminary pointing me towards Dionysius, and the idea that everything is a symbol, that all material points us through itself is something that I think maybe is what our world is stretching for. We want to know what's behind the form, what it has to say to us, and what it has to say about our situation.
Exactly. And I sort of see him as the key to the history of art. Not just the 5th century when he lived. And for listeners who aren't familiar with this, he's writing around 500 in probably Constantinople, maybe in Syria, we're not quite sure. He's right. He knows the Syriac tradition. He may have even been from Syria, but he's writing in this Greek milieu in the Eastern Christianity around 500, and he's claiming to be in this pious act of historical fiction, Dionysius, who was converted by Paul in Acts 17. So it's just in this wonderful creative act, he's bringing Platonism and Christianity together with Christ and the incarnation at the forefront. It's not some thin veneer of Christianity over Platonism. I believe it's thoroughly rehashed and reorganized and transfigured. And so this figure that means so much to Gary and I, who just discussed, I think he explains not just Eastern Orthodox art. I think he explains the whole gamut. I think he helps me understand the limits of representation, why you have to sometimes go to abstraction. Dionysius gives us the theological key to that. Symbols are true, but at the end of the day, every symbol breaks down as we move toward hypertheism, to the God beyond our mere conceptions of God. He's not denying God's revelation, but saying that we never fully grasp that revelation. And so I really enjoy showing students how he's inexhaustible. He explains Impressionism, I think, because in the Montmartre district of France, in Paris, that Montmartre area that everyone knows is where all the post-impressionists and impressionists hung out. The reason it's called Montmartre is because he's the martyr who's on that mont, right? He's the one buried there on that mountain called Sacré-Cœur with the church on top. And so I see him as giving forth not only the possibilities of Gothic light, which emerged in that part of France, but also Impressionist light. So that's the way I understand it. And I had a blast. I get to write this column, and I thought, if Dionysius is writing in a imaginative way, what if we wrote about him in an imaginative way? So I just imagine, what would it be like for him to appear to me in New York City and kind of walk me through the Metropolitan Museum of Art? So I had a lot of fun with that. It's just, I think we need to have more fun with church history.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That was kind of a later question, but you brought it up, so we'll talk about it. I think, your comment column, is it weekly, bi-weekly?
It's once a month.
Once a month.
Yeah.
I think it's the best. It redeems all of the internet for me.
You're very kind. Thank you for reading it. This is. I have wonderful editors there, Jeff Reimer and Ann Snyder, who invited me to do it. Who's the amazing editor at Comment. She gives me a very long leash. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Thank you for reading it. I mean that really sincerely.
Yeah, and we'll definitely put that in the show notes and have people subscribe because it is gold.
It is
It's
very
free
good.
too. It's free. It doesn't
Yeah,
cost
it's
a thing.
free. That's right. That's right. So back to maybe like Byzantine Christianity. I mean, your kind of special, your scholarship at least is Byzantine era, which maybe one could be pigeonholed of like that's the golden era, right? These kind of medieval years. That's good Christian art. But you're also in dialogue with modern art,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't kind of just write it off as nonsense. Can you talk to us a little bit about like how your understanding and your interaction with modern art?
Yeah, I used to write it off as nonsense, and I had good reason to do that because I was a jilted lover. So what happened was, the experience you just described in the art history classroom, I would go to the mats and I would stand in front of these Van Goghs and I would say, oh, I would just have I would have these transcendent experiences with art, and then I was betrayed. Then I went an exhibition that promised to, in some senses, strip me of the delusion of beauty. The museum labels that expressly evoked a nihilistic view of the world. Not that I was projecting it onto it, but it said, no, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We want to take everything away from you. I remember going to the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, which is I call it kind of a Costco of contemporary art, this massive depot, a former train station. They just pile it all in there. And I went to Bruce Naumann's anti-Holy of Holies, I call it. It was just this steel box, and the title I was like, what is this? I'm like, is this like some apophatic void where like Anish Kapoor, I'm trying to kind of get in touch with the transcendent? And then I look at the label, it says, room with my soul left out, room that does not care. And then if you know anything about Bruce Naumann's work, I mean, like right now, the Art Institute has his clown videos where just these clowns doing absurd and deliberately obscene things, the kind of stuff that can really scar a child if they see this. I'm not going to, take my kids into that. It's hideous. I mean, I remember watching a documentary of his work. He got some kind of state commission from Wisconsin to do a piece of art. And it was, this PBF documentary came in, tell us, Bruce, about your work. And he's just sitting there going, I don't really care about this. This doesn't really mean anything. And I'm like, it's fun for you to say that, Bruce, but what about when Wisconsin pulls the funding because of what you just said? So I had these repeated betrayals, and it really made me, almost out of revenge, like hate contemporary art because I had so many experiences of anti-transcendence. And then I started to enjoy writing like negative reviews because it was really fun to kind of pull the whole rug out from under it. And, that can sort of make you famous as an art critic. You can be kind of like the sniper who goes around, right? What's next? Because there's a lot worth sniping. Sure, yeah. And so for a time, I kind of gave up on that. And then I think I just kept at it. And as I kept at it, I found that the beauty resumed. If I, and I, I have every reason to get angry. I've done the research deep dives, and you find the expressly nihilistic claims. I remember reading a Matthew Barney. He might be the worst of them. A scholar in a high-level academic press art history, art criticism book says his aim is, quote, to usurp and distort the role of the creator. And he's showing these deconstructed, surgically modified bodies and loving the fact that it's deeply uncomfortable to be through his exhibitions. And that stuff trickles down. That stuff, mm-hmm. And in a world faced with war and violence, do we need that reinforced mm-hmm. in the world of high culture? So that was my wounding. But again, I persisted. Because it's my job. If it wasn't my job, I don't think I would have persisted. I would have said, this is not worth my time. But I kept going, and I found beauty rebounded. And so I think I learned ways of circumventing. When I critiqued art in that way, I was actually taking the bait. I was giving them what they wanted. Mm. And instead, I thought, what if I subverted this subversion and found transcendent ways to look at art intended to deny transcendence? So that's been my strategy of late. Instead of getting upset, I'm like, the best way to get back is to sweep them into something beautiful, even if what they're trying to do is deny beauty. Anyway, that's been my role of late.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I was wondering how, how does something that is expressly emptied of meaning, how does it get redeemed for you? How do you walk into before it and sit in it now, and all of a sudden it's filled with meaning? Is it your faith, like your spiritual sight, kind of an understanding that there has to be more to this, that it says something even about the longing of the artist? Or
yeah, that's a really good question. In one sense, I mean, T.S. Eliot is good on this in his After Strange Gods, an essay that he gave about 90 years ago at the University of Virginia. He talks about, looking for heresy, real heresy and real blasphemy. And he says it's actually really hard to do, because blasphemy would require a belief that which you genuinely have, that then you're genuinely trying to cast off. And he said that's a pretty rare combination in our world. So what you instead have people that never really had much belief at all, and they're sort of tinkering with these ideas, maybe because their soul is awakening from slumber, and so they're drawn to these ideas that they're kind of playing around with. And he's like, that's not blasphemy. And so, I would never want to refuse an artist the right to be blasphemous. But what's funny is that first of all, it's really hard to do. And secondly, I don't know how you blaspheme the cross. It's already as bad as it gets. Yeah. It's the omnipotent God. The worst possible thing that could happen to the omnipotent God has happened in a brutalizing, criminalizing omnibenevolence. This is horrible. So you can dip it in sludge. You can, roll. I mean, just what worse can happen? And so I think I sort of came to that realization that just kind of let it, don't be upset by it. And then I started to I have a really deep bank fund of transcendence. And so I just started to take from my surplus and start donating and say, here you go, you can have some of this. And you might initially say, well, that's dishonest, right? That's not calling a spade a spade. And again, I'm willing to do that. I like to say to my students, if you're offended by a piece of art, that it offends your faith, and you're going to take down this artist in a class presentation, I said, you can do it. And I said, do it, but just make it funny, make it clever. Make a smile as you do it. Really, don't shoot for the knees. Go for the heart. And really, there's room for that. But after that's done, after you've cleared your throat, you want to stay in the game, and hopefully you want to, bring this person who you're critiquing into the orbit of truth. And if that's what you want, maybe another strategy is required. I'll use another analogy. If I see blood and guts, I'm going to faint, right? And most of us are. That's a perfectly natural reaction. But if you're a physician, I sure hope that's not your approach. I sure hope you've overcome that so that you can move toward the necessary process of healing. Mm-hmm. And I think some of us, it might be called to not be offended at what the contemporary art world offers us, but to see the blood and guts, which is sometimes it actually is, and to say, Hermann Nietzsche, who throws blood and guts all over his contemporary art exhibition to try to resume the sacrificial rites of old, of course, with no one actually, sacrificing humans as the pagans had the guts to do, right? Yeah. And literally, and so to Herman, I'm not offended. Instead, I'm gonna push past that and ask you the intelligent questions. And asked you, is that really what you're after? So anyway, that's been the strategy that I've been taking. Mm-hmm. A quick example is the artist Kent Monkman, who is designed in some senses to offend you. Some of his most egregious works that will show a Native American, or in his case, he's from Canada, so a First Nations representative, actually raping a settler. And you might think, gosh, the public expression of unwilling sexual encounters, that's not good. No, it's okay, because Canada loves him because it's settler revenge, right? It's revenge upon the colonizer. And so not only is it allowed, but it's welcomed and celebrated. And so I could show you those images, and you would write for, most my students were looking, that's awful. Again, non-consensual sexual encounters is not something we want to promote. But what happened is I encountered his work. I read all the critiques that say, oh, isn't it great how he's overcoming the heteronormativity? And I'm like, oh, gosh, roll your eyes, because it's so uncreative. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's like he's the corridors of power. And I said, no, he's not derailing anything. He's the same corridors of power. It's just changing the direction of the train. Mm-hmm. So it's just revenge. That's all it is. There's nothing transcendent here. And so that was my initial reaction. And then I started to go more deeply into his work. And then I found that if I may be so honest, it was a bluff. Because that stuff sells for a secular Christianity-hating Canadian public. But then I found out his father's a Pentecostal minister, and that the Cree indigenous ancestry, which is rightfully his, was wonderfully ennobled by Christian missionaries who gave the Cree their language. And that's why his father was a Pentecostal minister, not because he was duped by the colonizers, but because Cree had become something profoundly Christian. So I did all that research, which your surface art criticism is not going to do on Kent Monkman. And then I found his non-ironic work, such as an image of Caravaggio's Death of the Virgin, but recast as an indigenous woman at her deathbed. Mm. And there was not a drop of irony in that painting. Mm. And everyone's like, oh, Kent Monkman, he's always ironic. I'm like, no, he's not. That's when the faith is coming forth. And I asked him a question about it. I met him and I said, tell me about your ancestry. And of course, he made like a salacious joke and everyone in the audience laughed because it was a public setting. And then he said, yeah, Christianity means a lot of things to indigenous people. And sometimes they embrace it positively. And my grandmother was one of those. And I was just like, wow. So that was the result of not taking the bait of critique, not endorsing it either. That would be particularly slimy to say, oh, Kent Monkman, I love those images of colonizers getting raped. Like that would be dumb, right? Mm-hmm. But to push past that and find the deeper conversations that are going on. So that's been the kind of strategy. And again, I came to it after having been deliberately, allowing myself to get offended over and over again. I just kind of got tired of that.
Yeah, I think that what you say, when you say stay in the game, the only alternative for us is to abandon it and become spiritualists, like over spiritualists, where there's no sense of grappling with experience. And so I think what Monkman does kind of with the Caravaggio is exactly what needs to happen. And that's it, the material that we all resonate with. Here's the spiritual reality that can be found in it, right?
Gary, I think that he is tired of it too.
That's right? Amazing.
That's why the beauty comes out, because it's like, oh gosh, one more rape painting. It's like, it can't be that fun. And so I found like he claims to have this alter ego, this cross-dressing chief ego who kind of won't go into all the sexual entendre and the names, but who kind of would enter into these art environments with full costume and seduce people in art openings. And this was the thing. And I just said, well, I think there might be another alter ego that Monkman's not, that is surfacing in his consciousness. And that is, he still is the son of that Pentecostal minister who actually, I think, wants to preach the gospel. But, it's like, who knows how many alter egos we have, but the art world can only accept some of them. And and maybe there's more to meets the eye. So yeah, I don't know.
That's great. That's great.
So I think it was maybe not your most recent book, but the one before that was on G.K. Chesterton and Indigenous people. So I'm just curious. I know I listened to a lecture you gave, I think somewhere in Tennessee, about Indigenous art and saying, we spend thousands of dollars to go to Europe for these classic paintings where sometimes they're in our backyard.
Yeah.
Like how did that journey arrive for you, like your interest in Indigenous art, and then how can you encourage us, or how can we help to see like our placeness, our ancientness where we are?
I'm glad you I've said, Alex, because a funny thing happened in that story. So I gave that lecture at King University, and a professor comes up to me and says, "Hey, thanks a lot. We're trying to recruit for our trip to Rome." And that didn't help. I was like, okay, sorry. So yes, Rome and Europe and France and Paris, they're all beautiful. There's so much there. But we have it here. Nathaniel Hawthorne writes about, describing, it's so hard to live in a world without ruins. And I go to Europe and I see all these beautiful Roman ruins and I don't have them here. And it's like, well, of course they're here. They were just buried. And so we are living in a time that is uncovering this, popularized in magnificent books like The Dawn of Everything, right, which has been published by David Graeber and David Wengrow since I wrote The Everlasting People, that sort of has brought so much of this to the fore, of just how advanced indigenous societies were, and the way we settlers had to convince ourselves that wasn't the case to justify our exploits. And what I find fascinating about it is, as that research comes forth, and there simply will be more of it, brace yourself, that the true story is that there are 4 centuries of Christian conversations with those indigenous cultures. And oftentimes there were horrible acts of insensitivity and bulldozing native culture, but just as frequently, if one knows where to look, there was enthusiastic embrace and the clothing of Christianity in indigenous form. And all those books have been written. I'm afraid that in my reading thus far, this Dawn of Everything book doesn't mention them as much. But those books are there. And in fact, one of the things I point out in The Everlasting People is scholars complaining about irretrievable archival losses that have resulted from a scholarly prejudice against Christianity. Meaning, when we found an indigenous painting of Christ, for example, well, that's not authentic. That's colonizer. It's like, well, hold on now. Is that not another form of racism cropping up, that you say they can't believe in Christianity because that would kill the exotic buzz that I'm seeking to attain from this other culture? How absurd. You have Nicholas Black Elk, who, the way that John Neidhart paints it in Black Elk Speak, he's as good as dead by the end of the book, because his culture had been taken away and the hoop of the nation has been broken. End of book, right? Meanwhile, Raymond Damali and others have pointed out that no, actually he lived many more years and shared the gospel with hundreds of Lakota who came to Christ because of his ministry as a catechist. Why didn't Neidhart tell that story? Simple answer, because it didn't fit Neidhart's white literary narrative of the exotic Native American who he got access to. This is big. And so what we've got to do is embrace this new renaissance that we're experiencing of the rediscovery of indigenous culture, and understand that in many cases it's utterly not only compatible, it's in some experimental way, it has already and long been compatible with indigenous culture in a rich and profound way. They knew that they found what they were seeking. In the Ojibwa tribe that I'm most familiar with, because of the work we do here, and that work has continued since the Everlasting People, and my brother, Michael John Resler, who I know deeply now from the Bad River Reservation on the shore of Lake Superior. And I call him my brother because he embraced me as part of his family as a result of the work that we've been doing together. And as I read and learn about the Ojibwa, I find that they believed in the Great Spirit, but they did not pray directly to the Great Spirit until the introduction of Christianity. This is what Christopher Vexey argues in his Ojibwa research, because it would have been presumptuous. You don't want to go to the Great Spirit directly, but then with the introduction of Christianity, there was an emboldening that happened. We can now, thanks to Christ, directly pray to the Great Spirit without intermediary, thanks to the mediation, of course, of Christ, who is the Great Spirit in the flesh. Is that not interesting, right? Is that not noteworthy? Is that just colonizing, right? It's just, gosh, this blunt instrument of colonization. We can't get rid of it, but we have to break it down into a more manageable tool and realize that colonization is very clever, and it might take the form of an anti-Christian prejudice.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. How about for we live in Asheville, right? So Cherokee Nation is in our backyard. How would you encourage listeners, like even or me, how can I engage with Indigenous art, appreciation of this culture that is in many ways we're standing on their land?
Yeah, that is a good question, a massively important one. And I think the first thing to do, and when I gave that talk, the book that was most important, and sometimes you know a book exists, and then the talk is the excuse to dig into it. And it was in particular the book, The Cherokee and Christianity, which is, you can get it for a song on Amazon. Some of these, it's an early adopter, kind of early approach to Native Americans, because of course the Cherokee were wildly ambitious in their Christianization attempts, and successful ones. The hymnody in Cherokee is extraordinary. And so first, realize that's there, and just having those names on the tip of your tongue and knowing some of these people. There was a person at that talk who's directly related to one of the figures that I mentioned, which was a thrill. So realize that this is not a vanishing people or a lost race. They're alive, they're around, they want to talk to you. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. I made my trip out to Oklahoma to visit. I try to hit at least all of the tribes that were immediately lived on where I live, and to go to where they've been placed. And a friend of mine, a Mennonite, taught this to me when I did the Trail of Death, which is a commemoration of the act of ethnic cleansing in the 18th, where the Potawatomi were removed from this area and deposited in Kansas. And we just traced the whole thing and prayed along the way with Potawatomi themselves. And what he told me, he was joining this, he said, every American, or North American if you're Canadian, should be able to answer 3 questions. Who was here before I came? How did they lose their land? What were the treaties? What happened? Was there a sale? Was there a theft, And where are they now? And so answering those 3 questions in some senses is enough. Like, ideally, you would go meet them, but they've got their own lives to live. Like, I kind of embarrassed myself many times by kind of showing up unasked, and I was just like, that's kind of annoying. Would I want that if someone walked up to, but again, when natural relationships present themselves, sometimes those opportunities are there. One of the best places to do that is through NATES, the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, which is now calls itself NATES because it's actually broadened to not just North American indigenous groups, but New Zealand, the Maori, etc. And it's all over the world. And they do a wonderful job of foregrounding these Christian conversations. And so the most sophisticated Christian theological conversations I know of are going on through there. If you can at all get to a NATES conference and just listen, I think you will find yourself deeply enriched. But again, the publications are there. And I also think it's important to say, just because someone claims to be Indigenous or authentically is Indigenous doesn't mean I'm going to say everything you say theologically is accurate. I believe in my theological training as a traditional Christian matters. And so if someone says, well, I'm Indigenous and therefore the resurrection doesn't matter to me, my answer to that is, you just told me about ethnic cleansing on a mass scale and missing and murdered Indigenous women. I don't think you get to say the resurrection doesn't matter to you, because it sounds to me like it matters, because those lives matter and the hope of the resurrection matters. And so in my, as I've been at this for a while now, I'm like, okay, I want to be in conversation with Indigenous people, and I'm not going to completely discard the creedal orthodoxy that I bring with me. And fortunately, there are many Native Americans who would say precisely that as well. And so I think that's the thing. When a conversation begins, you want to talk to as many people out there and not just say, oh, this book has all the answers. This book has all. Well, maybe not, because sometimes you'll have them expressly disagreeing with each other. I'll give you an example. When I was invited to my first sweat lodge, I get the invitation. Howard Badhand, a book given to me by my friend Damien, he said, hey, read this, really interesting. And it was about Native American healing and how, an invitation for non-Indigenous people to participate in these ceremonies out of an act of repentance and solidarity and working, which is wonderful. So I read that, and I participated as a Christian in this sweat lodge. And it was a moving experience. I wrote about it in The Everlasting People. And I didn't, I don't get any proceeds for that book. I didn't do it to sell books. It was an experience that I had. And then I read a book that said, how dare you, right? How dare you? Any white person, even if you're invited by the chief, you should refuse the invitation. I'm like, how rude is that? And so I won't say who it is. It's a famous Native American author who who has a very extreme perspective, who has since left Christianity. And I'm like, well, do I still listen to you? Because and so it's like, so you got to ask yourself, who are you going to listen to? And so again, it's cultivating those conversations. And I think after a while, it has to narrow. So there's this initial expansive phase where I want to learn about every native culture. And then you have to say, all right, I can't, but I can learn about the culture that was closest to me. So for you, it would be the Cherokee, Alex. And for me, it turned out that that the Ojibwa was even though I have Potawatomi friends who are down here in Chicago, where I go up every summer in Wisconsin, the Ojibwa turned out to be the place where that's been the most. And then it's a series of humiliations, one of which is a daily humiliation. I'm trying to learn Ojibwa, and I am awful at it. It is such a difficult language. And it's just utterly destroying me. And I don't think I'll ever be good at it, but at least I can get humbled over and over and over again. But I'm telling you, like, where are the theological conversations? There are verbs of relation in Ojibwa, even nouns of relation, that are perfectly compatible. In fact, far more compatible with a Trinitarian understanding of the world than this English language that we're talking and speaking in. And I'm like, who's done that work that I know of? So anyway, I don't think I'll ever make too much progress there. But this is you kind of feel like you're in boyhood again. You're like, this is exciting, this whole nother world that Christ is the servant Lord of, right? Christ in all things and in all elements and aspects of indigenous culture. And someone says, well, what about the demonic? Exactly. What about the demonic in my culture? It's horrible. And he overcomes that with his redemptive suffering love. He overcomes that in my culture, overcomes that in indigenous cultures as well. So that's been an exciting development.
Yeah. I think in many ways, like, the indigenous have like a more sacramental view of the world than,
instinctively.
Yeah. All right. I know we're getting long, but I have to ask about Mary.
Please. Yes.
So we're Protestants, right? Mary makes us weird, but you are kind of on a mission to rescue kind of Mary, and you talk about the different form images of Mary, but yeah, tell us about why we should care about Mary as Protestants and what her images, what the art of Mary has meant to you.
So Mary I've just described this to some other friends. We were talking about this on the Wade Center podcast. And I said, for a while, she was an idea, a necessary idea, an idea that buttressed ecclesial orthodoxy. It's right there in the creed, born of the Virgin, right? It's absolutely essential. And then without ever abandoning that she's an idea, she became the person that she always was to me. And she became a presence in the church and a presence in my own spiritual life. And that has grown over time in a very positive way, such that I cannot think of Christianity without her. And so either that's this horrible deformation that you take as this warning to don't become like him, or cultivate the same environment where she can have her rightful place in the Christian church. And then you asked about images. It's often said that there very well may be, and that's possible to calculate, but I wouldn't be surprised that if this is true, that there are probably more images of Mary than of Christ in the history of Christianity. Now, why is that? Again, images evoke presence. That's one thing. And also, she is the guarantor of Christ's humanity. She's the fortress protecting against Gnosticism. She's the queen of doctrine, as the Church of the East says in its Chinese documents. I love that, because they're sometimes dismissed as the people who gave up on Theotokos, and we call them Nestorian, wrongly so. Nestorian is just one of their figures. And I believe in the term Theotokos. Mary is indeed the Mother of God. But the Church of the East had other ways to express that. When the cool wind blew upon Moyen, it says in the Jesus Sutras, and they called her the Queen of Doctrine because she guaranteed the humanity of Christ. How could you not want her in your life and in the church? She long has been. And she is an evangelist. She brings people to her Son that might not come to her Son otherwise, Our Lady of Guadalupe being a chief example of that. This is how Mesoamericans came to trust in a very heavy-handed faith because Guadalupe made it their own. So that's one way of putting it. And I think she is enhanced. Well, it sounds like when I say enhanced, it's like some kind of like something you would install in your vehicle. No, I don't mean it that way. I mean, she has added depth to my piety that would not be there otherwise. So I'm deeply grateful. And one might understandably be concerned, does this detract from your love of Jesus? Not if it's healthy, right? If I started to talk about your mothers, you say, "Gosh, how dare you? I'm making fun of you. Why are you talking about my mother?" It's a way of honoring both of you, right? It would testify to a deepening friendship that I would even know the names of your mothers and care about them and honor them. It would be an expansion of our relationship if you were to talk honorably of my mother, to say nothing of speaking dishonorably about my mother, which I'd get a little upset about, and I'd have a right to be, as would you if I spoke dishonorably of yours. And that's how the Protestants have done it. That's so sad. Right? We've spoken dishonorably of Christ's mom. I don't think he likes that.
Do you have a favorite image of Mary?
Always switching those out. Lately, it's Walsingham because I just was there.
Nice.
And so I'll go by pretty much any recent pilgrimage I've been able to do. And if those listeners who are wondering, Walsingham is the premier Anglican Marian pilgrimage site. And I will simply say this to everyone listening: you must go. You must go. Go to Walsingham. And I know that's kind of torturesome to hear that, and if you don't have the chance. But don't worry, because there's a Walsingham in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. There's a Walsingham in Colonial Williamsburg. There's a Walsingham.
Really?
And there's all these outposts that kind of look like the original Walsingham with a statue. And Walsingham is the place, thanks to Alfred Hope Patton, where the Protestant tradition, well, in his case, he was Anglo-Catholic, but not Roman Catholic, Anglo-Catholic, atoned for its errors in discarding the Virgin Mary. And he single-handedly revived the premier English site that was suppressed by Henry VIII. And that's why I say go. You have to go to the shrine and see the work that was done in the last 100 years to give honor to the Mother of God again. And everyone was like, well, you're just going to become Catholic. He never did. He said, nope, this has to happen within Anglicanism to show the repentance and to show the honor that has not been given. Yaroslav Pelikan had an article making a very effective ribbing of the Protestant tradition. It was called "Some Generations Will Call Me Blessed," kind of mocking the Protestants who refused to honor the Magnificat, which says all generations will call me blessed. Well, Alfred Hope Patton, the great Anglo-Catholic priest, changed that. And I think that's a marvelous accomplishment to experience. Yeah. And when you go there, you've got these Orthodox and Catholics who are kind of camped out nearby to say, she's ours too. And she, of course, is. But Alfred Hope Patton was saying, right, but it's the Anglicans that we really resurrected this piety that now, of course, the Romans and the Orthodox can participate in as well. So the church has only one mother, and we can't divide her up anymore.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I use, in our book, I use Hans Urs von Balthasar talking about how the abandonment of Mary in reformational churches is to our deficit. And he says, here the world is becoming imageless and valueless. It is a heap of facts which no longer say anything, in which an equally imageless and formless naked existence is freezing and anguishing in death. The philosophy and the theology of the image stand and fall together. And when the image of woman has vanished from the theological realm, an exclusively masculine, imageless conceptuality and thought technique takes over. And then faith finds itself banished from the world and confined to the realm of paradoxical and the absurd.
What a quote. Is that from Glory of the Lord?
Yeah, yeah.
What a quote.
Yeah.
That is gold. Heap of facts. Does that not describe, I'm sorry to say, much of my theological education? Maybe that's why I was drawn to Marian piety. Heap of facts. I'll give you another quick one from Newman. And again, I say that, Balthasar wants to convert you. John Henry Newman wants to convert you. And again, there are worse faiths. The Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, God is in those communions, of course. But I believe he's also in this Anglican communion that I am called to. And so I quote this from Newman because he's right. And that the answer, I don't think, is to join Newman and oh gosh, I hate to say it's a little below the belt, but the Evelyn Underhill, in her letters, she's edited by Charles Williams. Her letters, someone asked her, well, why shouldn't I become Catholic? And she said, well, if everyone else had been as spiritually selfish as Newman and jumped over to Catholicism, the Anglican Church would be even worse state than it's in. I was like, oh, no, but anyway, so this is from a woman who really wanted to become Catholic at a point in her life, but felt called. And I'm not going to tell her Roman Catholic spiritual director, Baron von Hugel, that he was wrong and should have forced her over, right? Dragged her by the arm. No, you're going to. Steve felt called. So all this is a preface to this wonderful Newman quote. He says in the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, he says, you think Mary doesn't matter? What happened to the nations and the churches that got rid of her? Oftentimes, fast forward 100 years, they don't have crisp, clear doctrine anymore. Then they give up on her son as well. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? There are very rigorous Reformed churches but actually they do have a place for Mary as well. I have a whole lecture I'd love to give in our Mary class that I teach with Dr. Amy Peeler, where just hear all these ghost virgins and Calvinist paintings. She's there. She's there. She's in the Reformed tradition too, because they take their doctrine so seriously. So get rid of Mary. What are you left with? Heap of ideas. And ultimately, the ideas aren't even that interesting.
Yeah.
That's great.
If you wouldn't mind, we end in this way typically. Would you have a word for artists who would consider themselves Christian?
Yes.
Yeah. What would you say?
I do. So what I would say is, if the question was theological, someone said, I don't want to be a theologian, I would say to that person, you must apprentice yourself to one of the ancient doctors of the church, right? You apprentice yourself to Gregory of Nyssa, to Julian of Norwich. And I mean, you read them not just once, but 5 times, and then go back again, right? You really develop a relationship with that figure. And so what I would simply say to artists is apprentice yourself to one of the classic iconographical motifs of the church. You can find them. I love my friends at St. Paul's Orthodox Monastery. You can find it Skeet with a K, skeet.com, or just look St. Paul's. These are a bunch of Wisconsin monks who make the icons cheaply available to people in relatively nice machine production. And so what they're doing is they're taking the equivalent of St. Augustine or Gregor of Nazianzus, these great theologians, and these canonized visual ideas and making them available to people. The great Sinai Pantocrator icon. Go to the St. Catherine's Monastery icon database. That monastery is doing all they can, whether through the Index of Medieval Art in Princeton or through now even another project that they're trying to make their icons available. Go to the classic forms of Orthodox iconography and apprentice yourself to that. Please understand, I don't mean imitate it and become an iconographer. That would be great if you want to do that. It's a whole difficult level of skill that you could pursue. But be in conversation with that. Get one of those icons, put them up in your studio, and say, and again, you don't have to just even translate them into contemporary. Just let that classic Orthodox beauty surround your world. Some Eastern Orthodox will tell you, well, those belong to us. They don't belong to you. You need to become Orthodox. And I would say that's almost as absurd as me saying, well, you don't get to read the Bible. That belongs to Protestants. Now, I know they would say, well, no, we have wrote the Bible. And it's like, I get it. I know they would retort with that. But I'm saying all these things belong to us. So thanks to the internet, we have a whole mess of problems that we've never had before. Mm-hmm. Thanks to the internet, we have a whole slew of resources in the classic iconographical motifs that are available to us like never before. Find them and then say, you know what? I'm just going to take the classic Transfiguration icon, put it up, and I'm going to say, may my work serve that mystery. May it serve that mystery. Right? That's what Raphael did in his Transfiguration. It is a translation and a humble submission before the Orthodox icon of the Transfiguration. So that would be my answer, is that these riches belong to all of us. Take advantage of that. Step into Orthodox churches and worship with them. Even if you're not Orthodox yourself, go fill and fuel your mind with as much beauty as possible. in order to fuel your creative practice.
Nice.
Beautiful. Dr. Milliner, thanks so much for being with us. I wish we could talk for days, but alas, our time is up. But thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate your wisdom and sharing with us.
Thanks to both of you.